Welcome to Dr. Harmony. They say that a single word can build a cathedral of hope, but a single insult can burn it to the ground in seconds. Today's story is a chilling reminder that love is not a shield against the poison of deep-seated prejudice, and that sometimes the person who claims to protect you is the one holding the match. We explore a marriage that seemed perfect on the surface, a union of a successful white man and a brilliant black woman, until a moment of pure, unadulterated rage revealed a truth that could never be unspoken. It is a tale of betrayal, hidden agendas, and a journey for redemption that might have come far too late. Stay with us until the end, because the way this woman reclaims her power is a masterclass in silent justice. Now, let's dive into the heart of the storm. The house on Oak Ridge was a monument to Thomas's success and Elena's impeccable taste. To any outsider looking through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, they were the ultimate power couple. Thomas, a high-level corporate consultant with a charming smile and a silver tongue, always looked at Elena as if she were the only woman in the world. Elena, a dedicated pediatric surgeon, was the warmth that turned the cold, modern structure into a home. They had been married for 7 years, and in those 7 years, Elena believed she had found a sanctuary. Being a black woman in a high-stress, often biased profession, Elena felt that her marriage was the one place she didn't have to explain her worth. Thomas was her rock, her defender, and her biggest cheerleader, or so she thought. The shift didn't happen overnight, though looking back, Elena would see the cracks she had ignored. It started with small comments, jokes about her family's neighborhood that felt a bit too sharp, or compliments that felt backhanded, like how articulate she was compared to other women he knew. She brushed them off, attributing them to the stress of his job or his upbringing in a very traditional, sheltered environment. She loved him, and love often wears a blindfold. But the blindfold was ripped off on a Tuesday evening that started like any other. They were hosting a dinner for Thomas's potential partners. The pressure was high. Thomas had been working for months to secure a merger that would put him in the executive suite. Elena had gone above and beyond, managing her surgeries in the morning and coordinating a 5-course meal in the evening. During the dinner, one of the older, more conservative partners made a dismissive remark about the community center Elena volunteered at, calling it a lost cause for lost people. Elena, with her usual grace, countered with statistics and stories of the children she had saved. She was brilliant, composed, and undeniably right. The partner felt embarrassed. Thomas, instead of standing by her, felt the deal slipping. He felt the ego of the men he was trying to impress bruising. When the guests left, the silence in the house was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. Elena began clearing the table, expecting Thomas to thank her for the evening. Instead, he slammed his glass of scotch onto the mahogany surface. The argument escalated with a speed that made Elena's head spin. She defended her right to speak her truth in her own home. Thomas, fueled by whiskey and a perceived blow to his career, finally let the mask slip. He didn't just disagree with her, he attacked her essence. He screamed that she was ungrateful, that he had elevated her life, and then the word came out. A racial slur, sharp and jagged, spat with a level of hatred that Elena didn't know he possessed. It wasn't just a word, it was an admission. In that moment, he didn't see his wife, the surgeon, the woman he promised to cherish. He saw someone he considered beneath him. He saw a stereotype. Elena didn't scream back. The shock was too deep for noise. She looked at the man she had slept next to for thousands of nights and realized she was looking at a stranger. The betrayal wasn't just the word. It was the realization that he had been thinking it all along. He had been loving a version of her that he felt he owned. Thomas, realizing he had gone too far, tried to backtrack, his face turning a panicked shade of pale. But the damage was done. The air in the room felt toxic. Elena didn't say a word. She walked upstairs, her footsteps echoing in the hollow house. She didn't pack everything, just a single suitcase of essentials. Thomas stood at the bottom of the stairs, pleading, then shouting, then crying. He told her she was overreacting, that it was the alcohol talking. Elena didn't look back. She walked out the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind her with a sound like a gavel. She drove away into the night, leaving behind the luxury, the glass walls, and the man who had finally shown his true colors. The first few months after Elena vanished were a whirlwind of ego and denial for Thomas. He sat in their sprawling mansion, surrounded by the expensive art they had collected together, convinced that she would come crawling back. In his mind, he was the provider, the protector, the man who had given her a life of luxury. He told himself that she was just emotional, and that the harsh reality of the world would eventually force her to realize how good she had it with him. He spent his evenings drinking expensive bourbon, staring at the front door, waiting for the turn of a key that never came. He didn't call her family. He was too proud to admit he had slipped up. He didn't call her friends. He didn't want them to know the perfect Thomas had a crack in his armor. He simply waited, his arrogance acting as a buffer against the growing void in his chest. But as the weeks turned into months, the silence became deafening. The house began to feel less like a palace and more like a museum of a dead relationship. He realized that Elena hadn't just left him. She had erased herself from his life. Her side of the closet was empty. Her medical journals were gone, and even the scent of her perfume had faded from the silk pillowcases. Thomas started to lose his grip. His work began to suffer. The merger he had been so desperate to secure fell through because he couldn't focus. He found himself snapped at by his subordinates, his legendary charm replaced by a bitter, frantic edge. He realized, far too late, that Elena hadn't been an accessory to his success. She had been the foundation of it. She was the one who balanced his volatile temper, who gave him the emotional stability to navigate the cutthroat corporate world. Without her, he was just a man in an expensive suit, spinning out of control. Guilt is a slow-acting poison. It started as a dull ache and grew into a localized fire. Every time he saw a woman with a similar stride or heard a laugh that echoed hers in a crowded restaurant, his heart would skip a beat, only to sink when he realized it wasn't her. He began to replay that fateful night over and over in his head. The words he had spat at her felt like acid in his own mouth now. He tried to justify it. He was tired. He was stressed. He didn't mean it. But the memory of the look in her eyes, the sudden, cold realization that she was no longer safe with him, haunted his sleep. He began to understand that he hadn't just insulted her, he had dehumanized her. He had used his privilege as a weapon to strike at the one person who truly knew his soul. Driven by a desperate need for absolution, Thomas began his search. He started with the hospitals. He figured a woman with her skills couldn't just stop being a surgeon. But at every facility he visited, he met a dead end. Some administrators were polite but firm about privacy. Others, who knew Elena personally, gave him looks of such pure disgust that he had to look away. They knew. They might not have known the exact words he said, but they knew he was the reason the brilliant doctor Elena had walked away from her career. He hired private investigators, spending thousands of dollars to track her phone, her credit cards, and her car. But Elena was smart. She had anticipated this. She had closed her accounts, sold her car for cash, and vanished into the vastness of the country. He traveled to her hometown, a vibrant community 3 states away. He stood on the porch of her childhood home, clutching a bouquet of flowers that felt ridiculous in his hands. Her mother, a woman of immense dignity and even sharper intuition, didn't even let him pass the screen door. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She simply looked at him with a profound sadness. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady and low, "you didn't just break her heart. You tried to break her spirit. A man who does that doesn't get a second chance. She isn't here, and even if she were, she wouldn't be the woman you remember. You killed that woman the night you opened your mouth." The rejection from her family broke something inside him. He spent the next year in a haze of regret. He sold the mansion, unable to bear the echoes of her absence, and moved into a smaller apartment. He stepped down from his executive position, taking a less demanding role that allowed him to disappear into the background. He became a ghost of his former self. He spent his weekends volunteering at shelters and community centers, not out of a genuine heart at first, but out of a desperate, superstitious hope that if he balanced the scales, the universe would bring her back to him. He was performing penance, trying to buy back a soul he had sold for a moment of perceived superiority. He learned about the history he had ignored, the struggles he had dismissed, and the weight of the words he had used. He was changing, but it was a lonely, bitter transformation. He was becoming a better man for a woman who was no longer there to see it. 2 years had passed since the night the world ended. Thomas was sitting in a quiet park, watching the sunset, when his phone buzzed. It was an email from an unknown address. There was no text, only a GPS coordinate and a date. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it was painful. He didn't know if it was a trap, a mistake, or the miracle he had been praying for. He didn't care. He packed a bag, drove 10 hours through the night, and arrived at a small coastal town just as the mist was lifting off the water. He followed the coordinates to a modest, beautiful cottage overlooking the sea. The garden was full of the flowers she loved. And there, sitting on the porch, with a book in her hand, was Elena. But she wasn't the Elena he knew. She looked stronger, more grounded, and terrifyingly independent. She looked like a woman who didn't need him at all. Thomas stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, his breath catching in his throat. He had envisioned this moment 1,000 times, rehearsing speeches of grand apologies and promises of change. But seeing her there, framed by the morning light and the vast, indifferent ocean, rendered him speechless. Elena didn't jump when she noticed him. She didn't drop her book or rush inside. She simply looked up, her expression unreadable, and watched him as if he were a ghost she had long expected to manifest. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of an argument. It was the vast, cold distance of 2 years of separate lives. She looked radiant, her hair natural and flowing, wearing a simple linen dress that spoke of a peace she had never truly possessed in their high-pressure life in the city. "You found me," she said finally. Her voice was steady, lacking the tremor of anger or the warmth of nostalgia. It was a statement of fact, nothing more. Thomas took a tentative step forward, his hands shaking. He looked disheveled compared to the polished man she had left. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and the arrogant tilt of his chin had been replaced by a weary stoop. He felt like an intruder in a sacred space. This wasn't a woman waiting to be rescued. This was a woman who had built a fortress out of her own resilience. He realized then that his search hadn't been about finding her, it had been about trying to find the version of himself that he liked, the one that existed before he revealed his true nature. "Elena, I didn't think I'd actually see you," Thomas stammered, his voice cracking. "I've spent every day for the last 2 years thinking about what I would say. I've spent every night wishing I could tear those words out of the air and swallow them. I am so sorry, not just for what I said, but for who I was when I said it." He waited for a reaction, for a spark of the old Elena who would have reached out to comfort him when he was distressed. But she remained still. She closed her book slowly, marking the page with a dried lavender sprig, and stood up. She moved with a newfound grace, a confidence that wasn't derived from his status or his wealth, but from her own internal compass. She invited him to sit on the porch, but she didn't offer him coffee or tea. She treated him with the polite detachment one might show a distant acquaintance. Thomas began to pour his heart out. He told her about the mansion he sold, the career he stepped back from, and the work he had been doing in the community. He told her how he had educated himself, how he had finally understood the depth of the systemic pain his words tapped into. He spoke with a fervor that bordered on desperation, hoping she would see the new him. He wanted her to see the work he had put in as a down payment on a second chance. He talked for nearly an hour, his words a frantic stream of consciousness, while she listened with a terrifying, calm patience. When he finally ran out of words, the sound of the crashing waves filled the gap. Elena looked out at the horizon for a long time before turning her gaze back to him. "It's good that you've changed, Thomas," she said softly. "The world needs more men who are willing to look at their own ugliness and try to fix it. But I need you to understand something very clearly. You didn't do that work for me. You did it for yourself. You couldn't live with the image of yourself as a bigot, so you changed the image. That's growth, and I respect it. But don't mistake your personal growth for a bridge back into my life." The words hit him harder than any insult could have. He had expected anger. He had prepared for a fight. He hadn't prepared for her indifference. He realized that in her mind, the Thomas she loved was dead. The man sitting before her was just a reminder of a trauma she had successfully moved past. He started to protest, to tell her that their 7 years of marriage couldn't be erased by one night of madness, but she held up a hand. Those 7 years were built on a foundation I thought was solid rock. That night, I realized it was sand. You didn't just slip up that night. You revealed the basement of your soul. I can't live in a house where that basement exists, no matter how many pretty flowers you plant on the lawn now. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the sea. I have a life here, Thomas. I work at a local clinic. I teach. I have friends who see me, truly see me, without any conditions. I don't wake up wondering if a bad day at the office will turn my husband into an enemy. She turned back to him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of the old pain in her eyes, quickly masked by resolve. I didn't bring you here to reconcile. I sent those coordinates because I heard you were looking, and I wanted to give you the closure you seem to need, so you can stop haunting my family and my past. I wanted you to see that I am whole without you. Thomas felt a cold chill despite the morning sun. He looked at the beautiful cottage, the life she had built from the ashes of his betrayal, and he felt a profound sense of loss. It wasn't just that he had lost his wife, he had lost the right to be part of her story. He saw a man walking up the path from the beach, a local man, perhaps a fisherman or a teacher, who waved at Elena with a familiar, easy warmth. Elena waved back, a genuine smile breaking across her face. It was a smile Thomas hadn't seen in years. It was the smile of a woman who was safe. Thomas realized he was a ghost in her paradise, a remnant of a darker time that she had outgrown. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead, knowing that the happily ever after he had envisioned was a delusion. The sight of the man on the beach was the final blow to Thomas's fragile ego. He watched as the stranger, dressed in simple work clothes and carrying a bucket of shells, shared a brief, intimate laugh with Elena. It wasn't a romantic gesture in the traditional sense, but the level of comfort and mutual respect in that small interaction was something Thomas realized he had never truly fostered. In his marriage, there was always a power dynamic, a subtle hierarchy where he was the provider and she was the prize. Seeing her interact with someone as an absolute equal made him feel small. He realized that the luxury he had offered her in their old life was actually a gilded cage, and the bars were made of his own expectations. As the man continued past the house, Elena turned back to Thomas. Her face had returned to that calm, impenetrable mask. "You should go now, Thomas," she said, her voice not unkind but firm. "There is nothing left for us to discuss. You've seen that I'm alive, you've seen that I'm well, and you've said your piece." But Thomas couldn't move. The desperation that had been simmering inside him for 2 years boiled over. He didn't want closure. He wanted a reversal of time. He wanted to wake up in their old bed and pretend the last 2 years were a nightmare. "I can't just leave it like this," he cried out, his voice echoing off the quiet walls of the cottage. 7 years, Elena. We were a team. We were going to have children. We were going to grow old together. You're telling me that one mistake, one horrible moment of weakness, cancels out every I love you, every vacation, every sacrifice I made for us? He was gasping for air, the reality of his permanent exile finally setting in. He was looking for a loophole, a way to negotiate his way back into her heart, treating his apology like a business contract that just needed a bit more fine-tuning to be accepted. Elena walked closer to him, stopping just a few feet away. She didn't flinch at his outburst. "It wasn't a mistake, Thomas. A mistake is forgetting to pick up the dry cleaning or missing an anniversary. What you did was a revelation. It was the moment the mask slipped and showed me that you didn't see me as your equal. You saw me as something you had rescued, something you had improved by association. You didn't love me. You loved the idea of being the man who could have me." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "And as for the sacrifices you made, you did those for your own image. You wanted the perfect life, the perfect wife, the perfect story. The moment that story didn't serve your ego at that dinner party, you attacked the very core of who I am." Thomas fell silent, He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the more he searched his memory, the more he saw the truth in her words. He remembered the pride he felt when colleagues complimented her, not because he was proud of her achievements, but because her beauty and intelligence reflected well on him. He realized his love had been a form of vanity. "So that's it?" he whispered. "I'm just a monster in your story now? No matter how much I change, I'll always be that man to you?" "You're not a monster, Thomas," Elena replied, her voice softening slightly. "You're just a man who has a lot of learning to do, and I hope you do it. I truly do. I hope you find a way to be happy and to be a person of integrity. But you have to do it away from me. My healing required your absence. I spent the first year after I left unlearning the way you looked at me. I had to scrub the sound of your voice out of my head. I had to remember that my worth isn't determined by how a white man chooses to define me on his worst day." She stepped back toward the door of the cottage. "I invited you here for a reason, Thomas. Not for a reunion, but for a finality. I've already filed the initial paperwork, but I wanted to do this in person. I didn't want to hide behind lawyers anymore." She reached into the bag she had left on the porch chair and pulled out a thick envelope. "These are the divorce papers. They've been ready for a while, but I wanted to see if I was strong enough to look you in the eye and hand them to you without feeling like my world was ending. And I am. I feel nothing but peace." Thomas looked at the envelope as if it were a weapon. The white paper seemed to glow in the morning sun. Taking those papers would mean the official end of his identity as Elena's husband. It would mean the search was over, but not with the result he wanted. He felt a wave of nausea. "I won't sign them," he said, a childish defiance creeping into his tone. "I'll fight this. I'll prove to you that we can work. We can go to counseling. We can travel. We can start over in a new city where no one knows us." Elena shook her head slowly. "There is no us to fight for, Thomas. There is only you, clinging to a past that I've already burned down. If you refuse to sign, it will just be a longer, uglier process, and it will prove that you still don't respect my wishes or my autonomy. Is that how you want this to end? By trying to trap me in a marriage I no longer want?" She held the envelope out, her hand perfectly steady. Thomas looked from her hand to her eyes. He saw no flickering of doubt, no hidden longing, no crack in the foundation of her resolve. He saw a woman who had already moved on, who had already mourned him and buried him. With a trembling hand, he reached out and took the envelope. The weight of it felt like a mountain. He didn't open it. He couldn't. He just held it against his chest, feeling the sharp corners dig into his skin. He realized that this was his final test. If he truly loved her, as he claimed he did, he had to let her go. He had to be the man she needed him to be by finally being the man who stepped out of her way. The walk back to his car felt like a descent into an abyss. Every step Thomas took away from the cottage felt like a tether snapping, a lifeline being cut. He sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling, staring at the envelope on the passenger side. He didn't drive away immediately. He watched the cottage through the rearview mirror, hoping for a sign, a flicker of a curtain, a momentary hesitation in her posture, but Elena had already gone inside. The door was shut. The porch was empty. The world she had built was closed to him, a beautiful garden where he was no longer a resident, but a trespasser who had finally been escorted to the gate. The drive back was a blur of gray asphalt and bitter self-reflection. For 2 years, the idea of finding Elena had been the only thing keeping Thomas upright. It was his mission, his project, his way of avoiding the mirror. Now that the mission was over, he was forced to confront the man he had become. He checked into a nondescript motel halfway home, unable to face the empty silence of his apartment. He sat on the edge of the bed, the fluorescent light flickering overhead, and finally opened the envelope. The legal jargon was cold and clinical. Petitioner, Elena Vance. Respondent, Thomas Vance. The V, in the middle of their names, felt like a physical barrier, a wall of ink and paper that separated their souls. As he flipped through the pages, he noticed that Elena wasn't asking for much. She didn't want the remnants of his wealth, the alimony he was prepared to pay, or a share of the assets he had accumulated during his rise in the corporate world. She wanted her maiden name back, and she wanted her freedom. The lack of financial demands hurt him more than a lawsuit would have. If she had sued him for everything, he could have convinced himself she was bitter, that she still cared enough to want revenge. But this was the ultimate dismissal. She wanted nothing from him, not even his money. She was erasing his influence from her life with surgical precision. Thomas pulled a pen from the nightstand. His hand shook so violently that he had to grip his wrist with his other hand to steady it. He thought about the dinner party again. He thought about the way his friends had laughed at his jokes while Elena sat there, a target of their subtle, veiled racism. He remembered how he had felt a surge of power in that moment, a dark, intoxicating sense of belonging with those powerful men at her expense. He realized that the slur he used wasn't an accident of anger. It was the final brick in a wall of superiority he had been building for years. He had treated her like a trophy, and when the trophy stopped being shiny and started having a voice of its own, he tried to break it. He signed the first page, then the second. With every signature, he felt a piece of his old life dissolve. He realized that he had spent his whole life trying to win, trying to be the best, trying to own the narrative. But in this moment, winning meant losing. To be a man of integrity, the kind of man he had pretended to be in his apologies, he had to accept defeat. He had to accept that some things are truly broken beyond repair. He had to accept that sorry is a word for small mistakes, not for the systematic destruction of a person's dignity. By the time he reached the final page, the sun was beginning to rise over the highway. He felt a strange, hollowed-out sensation in his chest. It wasn't peace. He was far from peace, but it was a clarity he hadn't possessed before. He saw his life for what it was, a series of performances. He had performed being a good husband, performed being a successful executive, performed being a modern, enlightened man. But under the performance, there was a void of genuine empathy. He had used Elena to fill that void, and when she left, the void had expanded until it threatened to consume him. He walked out to the motel's small post box and dropped the envelope inside. The sound of it hitting the bottom of the metal bin sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. It was done. He was no longer a husband. He was just a man alone on a highway. He drove back to the city, but instead of going to his office or his apartment, he drove to the community center where he had been volunteering. He walked in, not with the swagger of a man looking for redemption, but with the quiet humility of someone who finally understood that he owed the world a debt he could never fully repay. He didn't tell anyone about the divorce. He didn't tell anyone he had found her. He just picked up a broom and started sweeping the floors. He worked until his back ached and his hands were blistered. He worked to quiet the voices in his head. He realized that for the rest of his life, he would carry the weight of what he had done. He would see Elena in the eyes of every woman he met, a reminder of the grace he had squandered. But he also realized that he couldn't spend his life as a professional mourner. He had to find a way to exist in a world where he wasn't the hero of the story. He was just a man who had failed, and who was now trying, in small, quiet ways, to be slightly less of a failure tomorrow than he was today. Life in the city continued with a rhythmic, agonizing indifference. Thomas fell into a routine that was a shadow of his former existence. He woke up early, worked his mid-level job without complaint, and spent his evenings at the community center in the neighborhood he used to avoid. He was no longer the man who demanded the best table at restaurants or the man who spoke over others in boardrooms. He became a listener. He listened to the stories of the young men at the center, stories of systemic hurdles, of being judged before they spoke, of the invisible walls he had spent his life helping to build. For the first time, he wasn't looking for a way to use information to his advantage. He was trying to understand the world through a lens that wasn't tinted by his own reflection. But the past has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, especially when it involves the complex web of family and social circles they once shared. A few months after signing the papers, Thomas received a call from an old mutual friend, Sarah. Sarah had been one of Elena's closest confidantes, and she was one of the few people who had gone completely silent after the split. Thomas hesitated before answering, his heart thumping. "Thomas," she said, her voice tight and professional, "I'm calling because there are things of Elena's still in the storage unit you two shared. The lease is up, and she doesn't want to deal with it." She asked me to ensure the items are either disposed of or sent to her. I need the key. The mention of the storage unit sent a jolt through him. It was a 10x10 space, filled with the someday items of their marriage, the nursery furniture they bought prematurely, the boxes of photos from their honeymoon in Italy, the wedding gifts they never found a place for. It was a time capsule of their shared delusions. Thomas agreed to meet Sarah at the unit the following Saturday. When he arrived, the air was thick with the smell of cardboard and dust. Sarah stood there, arms crossed, her eyes scanning him with a coldness that reminded him of the social cost of his actions. She didn't ask how he was. She didn't offer a polite smile. She simply held out her hand for the key. As they began to sort through the boxes, the emotional weight of the task became unbearable. Thomas opened a box and found the silk robe he had bought Elena for their 3rd anniversary. It still carried a faint, haunting hint of her perfume, sandalwood, and vanilla. He felt a sob catch in his throat, but he choked it down. He didn't have the right to grieve in front of Sarah. He watched as Sarah methodically packed away Elena's medical diplomas and her grandmother's old quilts. Everything that represented Elena's history was being reclaimed. What was left was the Thomas part of the marriage, the expensive, impersonal items that had no soul without her presence. "She's doing well, isn't she?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. He knew the answer, but he needed to hear it from someone else. He needed to confirm that his absence was, indeed, the best gift he could have given her. Sarah stopped packing and looked at him. "She's more than well, Thomas. She's whole. For years, I watched her dim her own light so she wouldn't outshine you. I watched her navigate your ego like she was walking through a minefield. That night you insulted her. It wasn't the start of the end. It was just the moment the explosion finally happened. She's a chief of surgery at a community hospital now. She's happy, and she never mentions your name. Not out of anger, but because you simply don't occupy any space in her mind anymore. You're a ghost, Thomas, and ghosts don't have power over the living." The words "you simply don't occupy any space" were the finality he had been avoiding. He realized that while he had been obsessing over his guilt and his journey of change, Elena had been busy living. She hadn't spent the last 2 years waiting for him to become a better man. She had spent them becoming the woman she was always meant to be, without the weight of his expectations holding her back. He felt a strange mixture of relief and profound loneliness. He was glad she was happy, truly glad, but the realization that he was completely irrelevant to her happiness was a bitter pill to swallow. It was the ultimate consequence of his actions, total erasure. As they reached the back of the unit, they found a large, heavy crate that hadn't been opened since they moved into the mansion. It was a collection of records and books they had bought together during their first year of dating, back when they were young and the world felt like it was made of possibilities instead of prejudices. Sarah looked at it and sighed. "She told me to leave this. She said she doesn't want the memories that come with it. You can keep it or throw it away." Thomas looked at the crate. It was the only thing left of them. He realized that keeping it would be an act of masochism, a way to keep himself tethered to a version of reality that no longer existed. But throwing it away felt like a final act of violence against the love they once had. He stood there in the dimly lit storage unit, surrounded by the debris of a broken life, and realized that he couldn't keep living in the past. He couldn't keep waiting for a redemption that had already happened in the form of her freedom. He looked at Sarah and handed her the remaining keys to the unit. "Take what she wants. I'll call a donation center for the rest. Tell her. Actually, don't tell her anything. Just let her be." Sarah nodded, a flicker of something resembling respect appearing in her eyes for the first time. She finished her packing and left without another word. Thomas stood alone in the unit for a long time. He eventually picked up one of the old records, a jazz album they had danced to in their first tiny apartment. He looked at the cover, then slowly, deliberately, he walked to the trash bin at the end of the hallway and dropped it in. One by one, he discarded the remnants of his vanity. He wasn't just throwing away things, he was throwing away the hope of a fix. He was accepting the permanence of the end. He walked out of the storage facility into the bright, harsh afternoon sun, feeling lighter and emptier than he ever had before. The months following the storage unit cleanout were a period of forced stillness for Thomas. He had finally stopped running after Elena, stopped running from his guilt, and stopped running toward a false version of redemption. He lived in a small, one-bedroom apartment that was functional and devoid of the grandiosity that had once defined his identity. He worked, he volunteered, and he slept. The vibrant, aggressive man he had been was gone, replaced by someone who moved through the world with a quiet, careful awareness. He was learning how to be a person who didn't take up all the oxygen in the room. However, the world of high finance and corporate consulting is small, and Thomas's past was about to collide with his present in a way he hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, while working at his desk, he received a notification for a high-level industry gala. Normally, he would have ignored it, but his current firm was a major sponsor, and his attendance was mandatory. He knew the crowd, the same men who had sat at his dinner table, the same men who had laughed at his jokes and reinforced his worst instincts. He dreaded going, but he realized that avoiding them was just another form of cowardice. He needed to see them to see how far he had actually come. The gala was held at a prestigious hotel downtown, a sea of black ties and silk gowns. As Thomas entered the ballroom, the familiar smell of expensive cigars and ambition hit him like a physical weight. Within minutes, he was spotted by Marcus, one of the partners who had been present on that fateful night 2 years ago. Marcus was a man who measured worth in net profit and considered empathy a decorative trait. He approached Thomas with a wide, predatory grin, clinking his glass against Thomas's empty one. "Thomas, my man, we haven't seen you in the inner circle for a while," Marcus boomed, his voice carrying over the string quartet. "I heard about the divorce. Tough break. But hey, plenty of fish in the sea, right? Especially now that you're back in the game without well, let's just say you're free to climb the ladder without any dead weight holding back your social standing." Marcus winked, a gesture so loaded with shared prejudice that it made Thomas's skin crawl. Thomas looked at Marcus, really looked at him. He saw the polished exterior, the expensive watch, and the absolute hollow vacuum where a soul should be. He realized that this was exactly how he used to sound. This was the brotherhood he had been so desperate to protect. "She wasn't dead weight, Marcus," Thomas said, his voice calm but dangerously sharp. "She was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I lost her because I was arrogant enough to think I was better than her. And frankly, Marcus, I was arrogant enough to think I was like you." The smile on Marcus's face faltered. "Whoa, take it easy, Thomas. I was just making a joke. We all know how it is. You have to play the part to get the deal. No need to get all woke on me now, just because she took half your assets." "She took nothing, Marcus. She didn't want anything that came from a man like me," Thomas replied. He felt a strange sense of power, not the power of dominance, but the power of truth. He spent the next 10 minutes dismantling the locker room talk that permeated the group, standing his ground as the men he once admired grew uncomfortable and drifted away. For the first time in his life, Thomas was the outsider, and he had never felt more at peace. He wasn't performing anymore. He was finally, painfully, being himself. As he walked away from the group, he caught a glimpse of a woman across the room. For a heart-stopping second, he thought it was Elena. The height, the posture, the way she held her head, it was identical. But as she turned, he saw it wasn't her. It was a younger woman, perhaps a junior executive, who was currently being cornered by a group of older men who were clearly talking down to her. Thomas felt a surge of protective instinct, but he checked it. He realized that his instinct was still to save or protect as a way of asserting control. Instead, he walked over and simply joined the conversation, using his presence to change the dynamic, making sure the woman had the space to speak and be heard without him taking over the narrative. That night, as he walked back to his apartment, the cool night air felt refreshing. He realized that the work of being a better man wasn't about one grand gesture or a dramatic apology. It was about the thousands of small choices made every day. It was about standing up in rooms where it was easier to stay silent. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone, especially those he had been taught to overlook. He wasn't expecting a reward. He knew Elena wasn't watching. He knew he wouldn't get a thank you from the universe. He was doing it because it was the only way he could live with himself. He sat by his window and looked out at the city lights. He wondered where Elena was at that moment. He imagined her in her coastal cottage, perhaps coming home from a long day at the hospital, her mind filled with the lives she had saved. He hoped she was happy. He hoped she was loved by someone who didn't have to learn how to value her. And for the first time, that thought didn't fill him with bitter jealousy. It filled him with a quiet, somber joy. He had finally reached the point where his love for her was greater than his need for her. He was no longer the man who had cursed his wife. He was a man who was learning to be human. The transformation of Thomas Vance was not a headline-grabbing event, but a slow, tectonic shift. He had become a man of shadows and silence, a stark contrast to the spotlight-seeking executive he once was. He spent his Saturday mornings at the community center, not as a donor or a VIP guest, but as a tutor for kids who needed help with their math and writing. He sat in small plastic chairs, his large frame hunched over, patiently explaining equations. One of the boys, a teenager named Leo, once asked him why a rich guy like him spent time in a neighborhood like this. Thomas didn't give him a lecture on charity. He simply said, "I'm learning more from you than I ever learned in a boardroom, Leo. I'm learning how to listen." But life has a way of testing the foundations of a new house. One Tuesday morning, Thomas received a legal notice that sent a chill through his veins. It wasn't about the divorce that was long settled. It was a summons for a deposition. A former colleague of his, a man named Henderson, who had been a close friend during his marriage to Elena, was being sued for corporate fraud and discriminatory hiring practices. Because Thomas had been the lead consultant on several of those projects, his testimony was required. Thomas knew what this meant. He would have to step back into the world he had worked so hard to leave, and he would have to face the truth about the good old boys club he had once championed. The deposition took place in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the city, a place that felt hauntingly familiar. Henderson was there, looking flustered and indignant, surrounded by a team of high-priced lawyers. When Thomas walked in, Henderson's face lit up with a false sense of camaraderie. "Thomas! Good to see you, buddy. We just need you to confirm the standard procedures we had in place. You know, how we always looked for the best fit for the company culture." Henderson emphasized the words "best fit" with a knowing look. It was the same coded language they had used for years to exclude anyone who didn't look like them. As the questioning began, Thomas felt the old pressure to conform. The lawyers were slick, trying to lead him into answers that would protect the firm's reputation. They asked him about the merit-based system he had helped design. They asked him if he had ever witnessed any explicit bias. For a moment, Thomas felt the temptation to play the game. It would be easier. It would keep him in the good graces of the powerful men who still controlled much of his industry. But then, he thought of Elena. He thought of the night he had called her that name. He thought of the way he had used his own merit as a club to beat down her dignity. "The system wasn't merit-based," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. The lawyers stopped writing. Henderson's jaw dropped. It was designed to replicate the image of the people at the top. "We use terms like culture fit and soft skills to disqualify highly qualified candidates of color, specifically black women, because we didn't want to challenge our own comfort zones. I sat in meetings where we laughed at resumes because the names sounded unprofessional. I was part of it. I helped build that wall." The room erupted in a flurry of hushed whispers and aggressive objections. Henderson leaned forward, his face turning a dark shade of purple. "What are you doing, Thomas? You're destroying your own career." "You're on the record." "I'm finally on the right side of the record, Henderson," Thomas replied. He didn't feel the rush of adrenaline he used to get from a win. He felt a deep, exhausting sense of relief. He spent the next 4 hours detailing every conversation, every biased decision, and every systemic failure he had witnessed or participated in. He didn't omit his own role. He laid his own failures bare for the court reporter to transcribe. He knew that by the time he walked out of that room, his name would be mud in the corporate world. He would be labeled a traitor, a turncoat, a man who couldn't be trusted. When he finally left the building, he felt a strange sense of lightness. He had no job prospects, no powerful allies, and a reputation that was effectively incinerated. But he could look at himself in the mirror. He walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench, watching the office workers rush by with their coffee and their cell phones, all of them chasing the same dragon he had once served. He realized that the success he had lost was never actually his. It was a debt he had been paying with his soul. He pulled out his phone and did something he hadn't done in months. He searched for Elena's name. He didn't look for her address or her social media. He looked for her professional work. He found an article about a new surgical technique she had pioneered at her community hospital. There was a photo of her in her scrubs, tired but smiling, standing next to a young girl whose life she had saved. Elena looked like a woman who was living a life of profound purpose. She didn't need his testimony to validate her worth, she had always known it. But Thomas knew that by telling the truth in that deposition, he had finally stopped being an obstacle to the truth of women like her. He wasn't her hero, and he wasn't her husband, but he was finally a man who was no longer a part of the problem. The fallout from the deposition was as swift and brutal as Thomas had anticipated. Within 48 hours, his current firm restructured and his position was eliminated. The industry blackballing was invisible, but absolute. Phone calls went unreturned, and lunch invitations vanished. For the first time in his life, Thomas Vance was truly on the outside, looking in. He spent his days in his small apartment, the silence a stark reminder of the empire he had burned down with his own honesty. Yet, in this forced isolation, he found a strange, jagged kind of peace. He wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't a consultant or a power player. He was just Thomas, a man living with the consequences of his history. He spent more time at the community center, now as a full-time volunteer. He used his remaining savings to stay afloat, living a life of radical simplicity. One afternoon, while organizing a career workshop for local high schoolers, he received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, expecting a debt collector or a telemarketer, but something nudged him to pick up. Thomas? The voice was familiar, yet changed. It wasn't Elena, and it wasn't Sarah. It was David, Elena's brother. David had always been the one member of her family who had tried to maintain a bridge, even when Thomas was at his most arrogant. "David," Thomas said, his voice cautious, "I didn't expect to hear from you." "I read the transcripts, Thomas," David said. There was a long pause. The deposition. "It's been making waves in certain circles. My mother showed it to me. She didn't say much, but she didn't throw it away, which is as close to a compliment as you'll ever get from her." Thomas sat down on a folding chair in the empty gym. "I didn't do it for a compliment, David. I did it because it was the truth. It was a truth I should have spoken a decade ago." "I know," David replied, "and that's why I'm calling. Elena. She doesn't know I'm calling. She's in a different place now, Thomas. She's built a life that is beautiful and separate from everything you represent. But she's also a person who believes in justice. Seeing you finally put your own neck on the line to fix a system you helped break, it mattered. It didn't fix the marriage, and it didn't erase the night you walked out on her dignity, but it showed that you finally understood the weight of what you did." They talked for a long time, not about reconciliation, but about accountability. David told him about Elena's new foundation, a program designed to mentor young Black women entering the medical field. He told him how she was thriving, not in spite of her past, but because she had reclaimed her narrative. Thomas listened with a quiet intensity, absorbing the news of her success like parched earth absorbing rain. He didn't ask for her number. He didn't ask David to put in a good word. He simply thanked David for the call. As the weeks turned into months, Thomas began to rebuild his life on a different foundation. He started a small, independent consulting firm, not for Fortune 500 companies, but for nonprofits and minority-owned small businesses that had been shut out by the very systems he once defended. He worked for a fraction of his old salary, but the work felt heavy with meaning. He was no longer selling culture fits, he was helping people build bridges. One rainy evening, as he was closing up his small office, he saw a familiar figure standing near his car. It was Sarah. She looked different, less guarded, more contemplative. She didn't have a storage unit key this time. She held a single, manila envelope. "Elena wanted you to have this," Sarah said, handing it to him. "She saw the news about the lawsuits following your testimony. She saw how many people were finally getting the settlements and the positions they were denied for years because you spoke up." Thomas opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph and a short, handwritten note. The photo was of a new wing at the hospital where Elena worked. Above the entrance, a plaque read, "The Sanctuary Center." The note was brief, written in the elegant, precise script he used to see on their grocery lists and anniversary cards. "Thomas," it read, "redemption isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a path you choose to walk every day, even when no one is watching. You chose the path when it cost you everything, and for that, I can finally forgive you. Not for my sake, but for yours. Do not look for me. Do not respond to this. Just keep walking. E." Thomas leaned against his car, the rain blurring his vision. He felt a profound sense of release. He had spent years begging for a forgiveness he didn't deserve, and now that it was given, he realized it wasn't a door opening back into her life. It was the final lock turning on the door of the past. She had forgiven him, which meant she was truly free of him. She no longer carried the weight of his betrayal. She had moved from a victim of his words to a witness of his change, and finally, to a woman who simply didn't need him to be anything anymore. He tucked the note into his pocket, a small talisman of a life he had lost and a soul he was slowly, painfully finding. The finality of Elena's note was like the cooling of a fever. Thomas spent that night sitting in his quiet apartment, the letter resting on the table before him. He realized that the greatest act of love he could perform for her now was to honor her request, to remain a memory. He didn't pick up the phone, he didn't drive to the coast. He simply allowed the silence to exist. In that silence, he found a new kind of strength. He was no longer a man defined by a marriage or a career, he was a man defined by his choices in the present. He realized that the world didn't owe him a happy ending just because he had finally learned how to be decent. The world owed him nothing, and in that realization, he found true freedom. He poured his energy into his new firm, which he named The Bridge. He worked with grassroots organizations, helping them navigate the complex financial structures they had been excluded from for generations. He became a familiar face in neighborhoods he once only viewed from the tinted windows of a town car. People there didn't know him as the high-powered consultant Thomas Vance. They knew him as Thomas, the guy who helped the local grocery store secure a fair lease, or the man who coached the high school debate team on how to dismantle an opponent's logic. He was no longer elevating people. He was standing beside them. Years passed. The gray in his hair became more prominent, and the sharp, aggressive lines of his face softened into an expression of permanent, thoughtful calm. He watched from a distance as Elena's influence grew. She became a national figure in medical ethics and advocacy. He saw her on the news once, testifying before Congress about healthcare disparities. She looked powerful, her voice steady and resonant, her presence commanding the room in a way that had nothing to do with the man who had once tried to diminish her. Thomas smiled at the screen, a genuine, selfless smile. He was proud of her, not because she was his, but because she was exactly who she was meant to be. The story of the man who lost everything to find his soul became a quiet legend in the city. He didn't tell it often, but when he did, he told it with a brutal honesty that served as a warning to others. He spoke to young professionals about the seduction of privilege and the rot of silence. He told them that a single word could indeed burn a world down, but that the work of rebuilding that world was the most important work they would ever do. He became a mentor to men who looked like him, teaching them that true power isn't about dominance, but about the courage to be vulnerable and the integrity to be just. One autumn afternoon, Thomas found himself back at the park where he had sat after the deposition years earlier. The trees were a riot of gold and crimson, and the air was crisp. As he sat on the bench, a young woman approached him. She was black, dressed in a white lab coat, her eyes bright with a familiar intelligence. She looked at him for a moment before speaking. "Excuse me, are you Thomas Vance?" Thomas nodded, curious. "I am." "My name is Maya," she said, sitting on the end of the bench. "I'm a resident at the community hospital. I'm also one of the first recipients of the Vance Elena Foundation Scholarship. I just wanted to say thank you. I heard about the deposition. I heard about how you stood up when it mattered. Because of that, the hospital got the funding it needed for our wing. Because of that, I'm a surgeon." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. He looked at Maya and saw the living proof of a legacy that had been built from the ashes of his greatest failure. "I didn't build that foundation, Maya," he said softly. "A very brave woman did. I just stopped being the person who was in her way." "Maybe," Maya said, standing up to head back to her shift. "But it takes a certain kind of man to admit he was the problem. That matters too." As Maya walked away, Thomas looked up at the sky. He felt a sense of completion. He hadn't won Elena back, and he hadn't erased his past. But he had contributed to a future where stories like theirs might not have to end in fire. He stood up, adjusted his coat, and began the walk back to his office. He had work to do. He had bridges to build. He was a man who had been forgiven, a man who had changed, and a man who was finally, at long last, at peace with the man in the mirror. Thank you for joining us for this journey on Dr. Harmony. This story reminds us that while we cannot change the past, we have every power to change the future through our actions today. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing your perspectives on growth and redemption. Until next time, stay grounded, stay empathetic, and keep seeking the truth.